Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to finish up this series on building a productivity bot using Power Virtual Agents. Today the focus of this video is going to be on getting important emails through calling the Microsoft Graph API. So let's go ahead, let's dive right in and let's go. So why is this content important? So we've talked a little bit about this before in previous episodes, so part 1 and part 2 of this video. And if you haven't seen those, I encourage you to go ahead and check them out. Link in the description. But the whole premise of this whole series is just around, we have a lot of data in a lot of different data services or data silos. So your email, your calendar, planner, spreadsheet. Even though Microsoft does a great job of linking all of these data sources together, it still requires you to alt-tab into these different web browser tabs or applications in order to get the current state. Purpose of this bot is to surface that information conveniently and quickly at your fingertips by using a Power Virtual Agent bot. Now, today we're going to be focusing on accessing important email through the Microsoft Graph APIs. And when we say important, that's really any email that has been sent with that high importance flag. There, the red exclamation mark you'll see in your emails, really it's that one. Now, as part of this episode, we're also going to talk about how you can use Markdown to provide some rich formatting when providing responses back to PVA. We're also going to talk about Graph API filtering using the HTTP action. And I'm also going to share something that you do want to avoid, and that's these inefficient filter errors. So I did spend probably about 20 minutes trying to figure out why my filters weren't working. I'm going to share those learnings with you here today. And then lastly, just as a reminder, if you are trying to call a Power Automate flow from Power Virtual Agents, it needs to be in a solution. It also needs to be in the same environment. Now, you may not have noticed that, but with Power Virtual Agents, they do run inside of a Power Platform environment. Make sure you're using the same environment, make sure you're using a solution, and then you'll be able to discover that Power Automate flow. Before we dive deeper into the content, I wanted to let you know about an emerging community found at serverlessnotes.com. This is a community resource that covers best practices, tips, and latest announcements built on contributions by technology enthusiasts from around the globe. On serverlessnotes.com, you'll find content related to Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Service Bus, Azure Functions, and much, much more. Serverlessnotes.com is brought to you by Serverless 360, a portal that is focused on operations and support for Microsoft Azure serverless resources. Now, this is a complementary tool to the Azure portal, and it helps organizations in supporting Azure serverless applications. You can find out more about Serverless 360 at serverless360.com. Much like in the prior episodes, I do like to talk a little bit about the underlying API that we're going to be calling. And in this case, it is a Microsoft Graph API and the list messages operation. And using this operation allows us to go ahead and retrieve messages into the signed in user's mailbox. And of course, we're not signing in through a back door. They're actually providing their token to Power Automate through the Power Virtual Agents experience. So we're going to ask them to log in. Once they've logged in, they have a token that they will pass in that has a short time to live that we will use to go ahead and retrieve the information from their mailbox for them. So if you want more information about this operation, go ahead and check it out at the following link. I'll include that link in the video description as well. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the security requirements again, and the reason for that is that I have it captured in the second episode of this channel, so 002, Connecting Power Virtual Agents to ServiceNow using Power Automate, and I will walk you through this entire experience of creating that Azure app registration. So if you haven't gone through that before, highly recommend you go ahead and do that. Otherwise, you might have some trouble getting this particular scenario working. Now, one thing I do want to call out that is different between this episode and the prior two, parts 1 and part 2 of building an enterprise bot, is that naturally we have another permission that we need to provide. And in this case, we're going to use the mail.read, and we will ensure that it uses a permission type of delegated. So what this means is we're going to be using the token of the user to access the mailbox. And it's not something that's going to happen through the application scope. It's going to be delegated scope. No admin consent is required for this particular scenario. Now, one thing you do need to know, and this is what's a little bit different than part 2. In part 1 of this series, you would have seen, or we would have discussed, going and adding a scope called calendars.read so that we can read the calendars information. We need to do something similar. So this is in the Power Virtual Agent authentication experience. We need to add mail.read as a scope. If we don't do that, we're going to get an error when we try to run our bot, our scenario. Now, what will happen is because we're adding something new, our end user is going to get prompted for consent. Now, this isn't admin consent, this is end user consent, essentially saying, hey, this service, which is our bot, is going to go ahead and try to read your mail. Are you okay with that? And that gives the end user the opportunity to have a say in it. If they don't want to do it, they can cancel and the whole session shuts down. But if they're okay and they accept, then we'll be able to access this information on their behalf. Here is the HTTP action that we're going to go ahead and use to connect to the Graph API. Now, there's some important things to note here. Number one, I don't want to be bringing back hundreds of emails into the bot. Like, that's just not a good experience for our end users. So what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and we are going to provide a filter. This filter is going to be based upon a received date time and ensuring that it is greater than UTC now minus 3 days. And we'll use the add days and then provide a -3 as the number of days that we want to add to the UTC now. And basically that'll give us any email that is newer than 3 days old. In addition, and this is what makes this whole scenario really work, is that we want to filter out where emails have an importance value that is equal to high. And so between those two filters, that's going to return the data that we want. Now, we also have the ability to restrict the number of emails to bring back, and that's represented here through the top filter, and we are going to be able to provide the number of messages, and that will come from our end user as part of the bot conversation. They'll get prompted for that value. Lastly, we will include this order by statement, which will order by our received date time descending. So naturally, we want to see the most recent emails show up and in that order. Now, this is where there's a bit of a nuance, so it's important to pay attention here. You can get an error that basically specifies an inefficient filter. And what it means is that the restriction or sort order is too complex for this operation. So let's recap the rules here. So the 3 rules are: properties that appear in our order by must also appear in our filter. Number 2, properties that appear in the order by are in the same order as they appear in the filter. Now, 2 and 3 sort of contradict themselves in some ways. In number 3, properties that are present in the order by appear in the filter before any properties that aren't. And this is our scenario. So we need to go ahead and respect rule number 1 and rule number 3. So let's just rewind here. So what we've got is we've got our 2 properties, receive date time and importance, as part of our query filter. So that's fine. But what that means is that we need to ensure that our order by properties appear in our filter. And we can see that our receive date time does. So that's good. But the only reason why this works is because receive date time is our first property in our filter. If these were reversed and importance was first and receive date time was second, or receive date time didn't even exist, we would get that error. So, but if you want to order by your receive date time, you need to ensure that receive date time is the first property in your filter, and then you're good. And that's exactly what's happened here. So our solution architecture, obviously we've got an end user who's overwhelmed with the amount of information they're receiving, and we want to build a bot experience that allows them to surface the information that's really important to themselves. And they'll do so by using Power Virtual Agent, reaching out to a flow, having a Power Virtual Agent trigger exposed that will prompt them for inputs. We will use those inputs as part of our HTTP action, which will call our Office 365 Graph API. We will get that data back. We want to make sure it's typed so that we can actually retrieve the individual data attributes. So we'll use parse JSON to help us with that. And then we will return just the streamlined values back to our PVA bot. And we'll do that using that action. So let's go ahead and let's dive right into a demo. I'm going to run the demo first, and then we'll dive into the individual components and take a deeper look on how they were configured. So first off, let's look at my email box. We're interested in these emails that have high importance and the red exclamation point. Now, to keep things simple, I only have 2 here, but obviously you can go ahead and add more emails. We're going to head over to our Power Virtual Agent, and we're going to restart this conversation. And we're just going to say, show me my important emails. And now I'm being asked to authenticate. So since I'm in this test harness, I have this experience where I can generate this token. So let's go ahead, let's hit enter, let's pass that in. I'm now authenticated. How many important emails would I like to see? Go ahead and hit 6. And that means up to 6. In this case, we don't have 6, but we'll retrieve up to 6. And here are the emails that have been returned. So we can see who the emails are from, their email address, and that's been bolded. So this is Markdown. We've got the subject. We've got the local date time that it was received, and then we have the email link. So we can go ahead and click on this email link, and it'll actually take us over to the email itself. So we can actually go ahead and read it. Perhaps there's attachments that come with it. And we don't want to surface all that info into the bot, but this becomes the launching pad. For that, obviously we can see that the message was sent with high importance, so that's cool. So now, since we're in Power Virtual Agents, let's just go ahead and see how this topic was designed. Here we've got the trigger phrases. Naturally, I could go ahead and build that out and provide more and more examples of when this topic should actually get kicked off. As you'll notice, I don't have an exact match going on here. This is where the natural language processing is being kicked in. And we can see that show my important emails is related to this specific topic. But Microsoft was able to determine that without me having to hard code those scenarios. Next up, I'm going to provide a message just saying, please authenticate. We then prompt the user with a sign in. Provided they signed in, we head down this leftmost path. And we will then provide another message indicating that they are logged in. We'll ask them how many emails we'd like to see. In this case, we're just going to use a number. There's many different options here, but we will just use number. So if I went ahead and tried to write a sentence, it's going to say, what are you talking about? I don't understand. I need a number. We will store that value in a variable, which is called num messages and is of type number. Next up, we're going to go ahead and call our flow. So what does that experience look like? We can click on a plus sign, click call an action. And this is where all of our flows that are in a solution within the same environment will get surfaced. And here we've got the previous flows that have been used in the series, but this is the one that we want to focus on today. Get important emails. Because we've exposed 2 properties as part of our trigger, we now get prompted to populate them. And we're going to do that here. We provide our auth token and the number of messages we want to receive. And then Power Virtual Agents is smart enough to know what Power Automate is going to return. In this case, it's a single value of type text. And we could go ahead and use this variable downstream in our other processes. And that's exactly what's happened here. Here we've got a variable called email response, which will capture the response coming from Power Automate. And then we're just going to display it. Now, I'll explain why I haven't added any more rich formatting on top of this. We're going to actually do that in Flow. And really as a result of managing our exception handling, where we don't want to have a lot of logic in Power Virtual Agents to handle that. It's probably easier just to do that inside of the flow itself. So here we are. Here's my flow. We've got our Power Virtual Agents trigger, our 2 inputs, auth token, num messages. Then we're going to expose a variable. And this variable is going to be of type string. And we're going to have a value. And it's just sort of our boilerplate. You have the following important emails, colon, and then a carriage return. And what we'll do is as we go through and loop through all of these different emails that are being retrieved from Graph, we're going to go ahead and append it to this string variable. And that's why we want this boilerplate as this header, essentially. Next up, we're going to add a scope, and the scope is being used to help us manage our exception handling so that we know whether or not these operations are succeeding or failing. And then we can go ahead and detect that after the fact. Here's our HTTP action. It is what I showed you previously in the slides. One difference here is I'm showing you the authentication bit, which is going to be of type raw. And then we're going to have a value of bearer space and then our auth token, which was passed in from our Power Virtual Agent. Naturally, whenever we use HTTP, our responses are going to be untyped. So we won't be able to use the dynamic content unless we take that content and put it through a parse JSON action. And that's what we're going to do here so that we will now be able to have a type response. Now, how do we get this type response? Go ahead and run your flow up until this point, and then go into your run history and then check for the output of this action, which will give you that response. Since we will have many or multiple emails being returned, we will go ahead and loop through them. And that's what's going on here. We're going to loop through the value. And then what we want to do is parse the from. Now this is a little interesting in the sense that we have a complex object being returned as part of our payload. And here it is here. We've got this from node and then a nested email address node, which includes two properties. So what we can do is basically copy this selected node, like where the opening and closing parentheses, and then put it into this parse JSON action and then include the content from the from field. And then we'll be able to access the name and the address. And that's exactly what we do in this action below here when we want to prepare our response for the bot. Next up we want to do is we want to go ahead and convert the time, because all cloud time is in UTC, and convert it into local time. For me is mountain time, so we can go ahead and do that. And then we will go ahead and append to string to our email response variable. And this is where we can use Markdown, where we use ** and as an opening, and then ** as a closing delimiter. And then what that means is everything in between those stars will be bolded. Subject and received is just standard, but here we will use a square parentheses around email link, and then these round parentheses around our web link, and that will give us that hyperlink inside of Power Virtual Agents. As I talked about before, we want to address or be able to handle both successful and failed executions. And to do success, that's normal. That's this path here. And how we get this split action thing going here is we add a parallel branch. And then here we'll go ahead and just provide a email response property and then set it to our email response variable, which is basically all of the email information being appended to one another. Now in this side, this is going to deal with our failure. We'll use the same property name. You need to do that just so you don't confuse Power Virtual Agents. And then here we'll just provide an error message. Now I've kept it simple. You can obviously expand upon that as required. Now you'll notice that we've got this red dotted line over here, and that represents that we are going to only run this path when this scope has a failed status. So this is kind of like our catch. If you think about try catch, this is going to catch that error and then provide a different response. So that is our solution in a nutshell. And obviously this is a pattern that you can extend, and you just need to plug in different API operations that cover different scenarios as part of the Graph API. So you can go ahead and do that and then basically wire it up and then extend that, add the topic into your bot, and you'll be good from that perspective. Thanks for checking out this episode. If you're not following me on Twitter, I would encourage you to do so. You can find me at Weare. Obviously, you're on my YouTube channel, and I certainly appreciate you coming by and checking out this video. If you haven't subscribed, really appreciate you going ahead and doing so. Also, if you liked the video, please go ahead and give me that thumbs up. If you have any questions, comment, feedback, go ahead and add that in the comment section, please. That concludes this episode. We will be back next week. I am working on an episode that includes ServiceNow and going deeper in that technology and how you can basically subscribe to ServiceNow events using Power Automate. So that'll be cool. I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. Take care, and we'll see you again next week.